So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. This is the virtual reading group at the Hannah Arendt Center. And we have, I guess, the first coronavirus edition of the virtual reading group. Um, we can talk about it at the end today. It may be worthwhile doing some more, simply because a lot of us are going to have time inside. And so we can talk about if there's anything we want to do, maybe related to this as well, something a little different. I feel like Sam and I are prepared to teach a little bit virtually since we've been doing this for the last few years. But welcome, and I hope you're all staying safe and ready to hunker down for a few weeks at least. I hope it's only that long. We are reading, coming near the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem. Actually, today we'll read the last two, I guess, chapters of the narrative. And then the next session, which is scheduled for April 17th, but we may do it a little earlier or do it twice, is on the epilogue and then the postscript. The epilogue was originally published with the articles and the book. It was her, as she says, this is a factual account, or as she claims it is a factual account. I think one of the questions that we need to begin to ask ourselves, having read this book, is to what extent we agree with her. I think this is one of the big areas of dispute about the book. Is she says, I'm just giving a factual account, and obviously some people think she went much further than that. The epilogue is where she gives the lessons that she draws from it, or many of them. And then the postscript was published later as a response to some of the intense criticisms of the book. And so we'll talk about them. They are, I think, in many ways, the epilogue and the postscript are the two chapters that are most read, most talked about, and will be quite interesting. So we currently have them together in one session. Maybe we'll split it up, since instead of going on vacation, we're all cooped up in our apartments, or at least some of us are. So the evidence and witness chapters, the first chapter that we read for today, is Arendt's attempt to give a sense of what kind of evidence and what kind of witnesses were presented at the trial. It's more about, I think, witnesses than evidence. She talks a little bit about some of the papers, and she says that most of the SS documents they tried to destroy them in the last weeks of the war, but there was enough that wasn't destroyed that they were largely preserved and made available in Nuremberg, and those were used by the prosecution. I mean, she makes an interesting and I guess somewhat tendentious point that both at Nuremberg and here in the Eichmann trial, the vast majority of the work done on those papers was done by the prosecution. Neither at Nuremberg nor in Jerusalem did the defense have the resources to go through the mountainous materials. And so she says she wonders, and one must wonder, what would have been different if in our knowledge of the final solution and the Holocaust, if in either of these cases the defense had more of a knowledge to tell the story. Somebody is sharing their screen. I'm not sure who it is, but you might want to see if you can stop doing that.
It's
Um,
Nancy Felsen, if she could stop screen
Nancy, maybe
sharing.
you can unshare your screen. Um, but the main thrust of this first chapter on evidence and witnesses are her account of what she considers to be um, five of the most important witnesses at the trial. Uh, the first and most important is Eichmann himself, who was on the stand for 34 days total. Um, and she's talked about that the whole book, so it doesn't get much more um, play here in this chapter. 62 of the sessions, so Eichmann was on stand for 34 days. 62 of the sessions was dedicated to what we call painting, what was called by the prosecution, painting the picture. These were largely survivors um, and people who were telling their story. Um, as you know from having read what we've read already, Arendt was not thrilled with this part of the trial. Um, she thought that most of the witnesses had very little to do with Eichmann, were boring. She knew it. Most of them knew it. And why was it being done? The bulk of the witnesses, she says on page 225, 53 of them came from Poland and Lithuania, where Eichmann's competence and authority had been almost nil. Some came from, other countries like France, Holland, Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Italy, Greece, Russia, Yugoslavia. Um, 13 from Hungary, and only a few came from Theresienstadt, where Eichmann actually had um, some authority. So she has some worry that a lot of these witnesses were somewhat irrelevant. The then she talks about a number of specific witnesses that, for some reason, resonated with her. One was someone named uh, Mr. Aaron Hotter Yeshai. And even though a lot of what he said she thought was somewhat propagandistic and based on some books he had written, she thought he told one simple truth, and that it was a truth that was memorable to the whole group, which was that those who survived only wished to go and be with people who were Jewish, and thus to Israel. Um, she also talks about another witness who identifies himself as K. Zetnik, a name for a concentration camp survivor. And for her, he was an example of sort of someone who was irrelevant. And when the judges and the prosecutor actually tried to bring him to relevance, he fainted and never even answered their questions. Um, the two most uh, impactful witnesses of the whole trial, besides Eichmann, for her, are one is Zindel Grinspan, the father of Herschel Grinspan, and Herschel Grinspan on November 7th, 1938, just before Kristallnacht, at the age of 17, in Paris, walked up to and shot the German, a German official, the Legionsrat Ernst von Rath. And this assassination is actually what triggered Kristallnacht throughout Germany. For her, there was a number of things that made this testimony deeply meaningful. One was questions about why Herschel Grinspan had actually shot Ernst von Rath. There's some suggestion that they were both gay and maybe involved, although there's no evidence for that. It seems that Ernst von Rath was actually somewhat of an anti-Nazi official, although, again, we're not entirely sure. But in the end, what really mattered for Arendt about Zindel Grinspan's testimony is that as she said, he told the story of his being evicted, his being sent out, forced immigration out of Germany, where he had lived for 27 years, to the Polish border. He told the story of the SS men were whipping us. Those who lingered, they hit, and blood was flowing on the road. They tore away our suitcases from us. They treated us in a most brutal way. This was the first time that I'd seen the wild brutality of the Germans. They shouted at us, "Run, run." I was hit and fell into the ditch. My son helped me, and he said, "Run, father, or you will die." When we got to the open border, the women went first. The Poles knew nothing. And it goes on. And for Arendt, she sums this up and she says, this is on page 229, the story took no more than perhaps 10 minutes to tell, and when it was over, the senseless, needless destruction of 27 years in less than 24 hours, namely that the Grünspans had built a life in Germany for 27 years, and this destruction of this 27-year life in 24 hours, one thought foolishly, everyone should have his day in court. And so what here is Arendt saying is, when somebody like Grünspan knows how to tell their story, then everybody should be able to tell their story and have their day at court. The problem, she says, was that most people who were brought to testify didn't know how to tell their story, didn't know how to make their story gripping and meaningful. And as a result, the stories were largely cliche, boring, and not meaningful. That was her understanding of the importance of the Grünspan testimony. The last witness who she talks about is Abba Kovner, and Kovner was meaningful largely because he had heard of Eichmann through a German Feldwebel or sergeant named Anton Schmidt. And Anton Schmidt was someone who was responsible for rounding up prisoners and stray German soldiers cut off from their units, but he also encountered many Jewish resistance fighters, and he helped them, gave them forged papers and supplies and trucks, and he did it for no money. And he was arrested and executed by the Germans in 1942. For Arendt,
Roger,
again, she writes.
Roger, Abba Kovner
Yeah.
is a famous Israeli writer, in case that she didn't mention that, but he is a famous writer.
Yes, I mean, she describes him as a poet, a poet and author. So yes, he is quite famous, and he was largely talking about a lot of his books, but he did tell this story about Anton Schmidt. And so Arendt says about this, during the few minutes it took Kovner to tell of the help that had come from a German sergeant, a hush settled over the courtroom. It was as though the crowd had spontaneously decided to observe the usual 2 minutes of silence in honor of the man named Anton Schmidt. And in those 2 minutes, which were like a sudden burst of light in the midst of impenetrable, unfathomable darkness, a single thought stood out clearly, irrefutably, beyond question. How utterly different everything would be in this courtroom today, in Israel, in Germany, in all of Europe, and perhaps in all countries of the world, if only more such stories could have been told. And this raises the question that she ends this chapter with, which is the question of, first, why didn't more people do what Anton Schmidt did? and secondly, does it matter? Does it matter if people resist? And she quotes a German author named Peter Baum, who wrote a book called the Unsichtbare Flagge, the invisible flags, in which he said that the reason he and other Germans didn't do anything is that they knew that anyone who had seriously protested or done anything against the killing unit would have been arrested within 24 hours and would have disappeared. They would have died in silent anonymity, and they would have sacrificed their lives in vain. The sacrifice, he says, would not be morally meaningless, but it would be practically useless. And Arendt says that the fatal flaw in this argument is the fact that someone like Anton Schmidt was remembered in this trial. The fact that people who did resist are remembered today, including Franz Jägerstätter, who I've talked about a bit, who was the hero of the movie that just came out, A Hidden Life by Terrence Malick, and many others, not as many as we'd like. And so Arendt says that what we learned is that nothing can be ever practically useless, at least not in the long run. And she ends this chapter writing, "For the lesson of such stories is simple and within everybody's grasp. Politically speaking, it is that under conditions of terror, most people will comply, but some people will not. Just as the lesson of the countries to which the final solution was proposed is that it could happen in most places, but it did not happen everywhere. Humanly speaking, no more is required, and no more can reasonably be asked for this planet to remain a place fit for human habitation." And so, just like the Danes didn't comply, and as a result, most of the Jews from Denmark were saved, there were people who didn't comply and who did resist. And while they may have been executed and it may have seemed practically useless at the time, these stories, she thinks, matter. And they matter insofar as they teach us what it means for this planet to be a fit for human habitation. And that's how this chapter ends. Why don't I stop there before we talk about the next chapter, which is important but a little more factual. And let's talk about this first chapter, and then we can come to the second chapter a bit later. Are there comments or thoughts?
Hi, Roger. It's Margaret. Just a quick, maybe blindingly obvious, but I mean, I was really struck by the end of this chapter. And then it struck me that what she's saying is, if you want evidence and witnesses, there will always be evidence and witnesses of those people who resist, no matter whether, what. And so, throughout the chapter, she's critiquing whatever, no matter evidence and witnesses was presented at the actual trial. But the real evidence and witnesses in history are those people, it seems like she's saying, who will buck the tide, put it simplistically. That's all.
Absolutely. One thing I can add is that, and she'll talk about this in the postscript, so I'll come back to it more in depth maybe then. But the unnamed antagonist who she is arguing with at the end of this chapter is the Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Stanley Milgram experiments, which were done around this period in the early 1960s. And he says he was motivated to do them in response to the Eichmann trial, and then Arendt's writing about the Eichmann trial is what he was and then as he was writing about the experiments, he was responding to Arendt's writing. And he concludes that what his experiments show is that many, if not most people, will comply with authority and do evil things, hurt people, when they're told to by authority, even when they know that doing so is wrong. And he draws the lesson from that we can't, that there's a situational ethics. It's a word that came up, I think, last week in our conversation, and that we can't really blame people for this because this is how people act. And in these last sentences, Arendt is arguing against that, right? What she's saying is the lesson of these stories is that, politically speaking, some people will comply, but some people will not. And just because some people will doesn't mean that those who do comply are excused. She does not think that is the case, and she'll talk more about this in the postscript. And we can talk about it more at length there, or if you want to talk a little bit about it now, we can. But what she's going to say is that in politics, even though most people will comply, that doesn't excuse you from complying excuse you when you do, and you have to be held to a higher standard. And even if it's practically useless, you have to understand that it's not humanly useless. I think that's her argument.
Can I add something to that, Roger? Can you hear me? I completely agree with that. And just the other side of that, these last 2 pages of this chapter have always really stuck out to me is the radical emphasis she is placing upon political act of storytelling and the power of storytelling. And the claim, I think it's the other side of her fundamental claim about plurality and the idea that men and not man inhabit the earth and share the world in common. Is but there can be no absolute. That holes of oblivion cannot actually exist because of this fundamental plurality, which conditions our life. And this idea that there's always somebody left. There will always be somebody to tell the story. And I just wanted to add that because I think the way that she connects this back, there's a kind of this kind of very subtle hopefulness she has about humanity that I think presses through in the way she's conceptualizing the importance of storytelling.
I mean, I think that it's a great story to tell. It reminds me a little also to say that it's not even ineffectual what he did, even though he was murdered for it. There's the starfish story where somebody comes upon a beach where lots of starfish are dying because they've been beached. And there's somebody throwing one at a time, but there's thousands upon them, one at a time back into the water. And then the person who encounters that savor of 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 starfish says, what difference does it make to throw one at a time? He says it makes a difference to this one, and he throws another one in. But the trouble is, and there were many, many more stories than the stories we even know, because many of them were lost to a lack of a witness still alive to talk about it. It just seems that the Holocaust is not the place to get hope about that, I would think, because it's a story actually of an unbelievable amount. It's not there's some like this and some like that. There's 1 to thousands upon thousands stories as a ratio. Otherwise, you wouldn't lose 3 million out of 3.1 million Jews in Poland. So that's the little bit I found it almost bizarre to hear that last part of that chapter. I'm not debating if her point is to try to undermine Eichmann's defense that because most didn't, I'm therefore absolved of guilt. Most didn't resist, I'm absolved of guilt. That's fine. But if this is an educative story to show that there's hope, that hope is extinguished if the Nazis don't venture into Russia and get slaughtered by the Soviets and decimated such that they would lose, because they would have continued to kill all the Jews in Sweden who had been rescued from Denmark and all the Jews in Bulgaria and all the stories of Anton Schmidt. So And Milgram's evidence is devastating because it's taking place in a condition where there is no terror, and yet people, 2 out of 3, will actually take a person to their death if told so by an authority who says it's for the better good.
Roger, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. I was saying I think that was very helpful and important. Just a couple of points. One is I don't think Arendt's argument is that we should have hope. I mean, she doesn't really talk about hope. I think if I'm trying to understand the point she's making, it's not that we should have hope about preventing the Holocaust. It's that we should know that if we act, even though it seems in the short term that our actions will be practically useless, they rarely are in the long term. That they will become, as Sam was saying, stories, and that those stories will become part of the world. Is that a hopeful story? Is that a hopeful account by Arendt? I'm not sure it's hopeful or pessimistic. I think it's an attempt to say that the world remembers things, and that those things that we do become part of the world we share together. So that, when Franz Jägerstätte in Austria refuses to sign a loyalty oath and is put to his death, not only do people in Austria and Germany have to confront him, and do they get made uncomfortable by him, but 30 or 40 years later, he's canonized, and the church lionizes him or canonizes him. And then 60, 70 years later, a major motion picture is made about him, and he enters a kind of more popular discourse. And that these stories are important, and they come back, and they become part of our common world. And that as a result, I mean, in this, the idea of storytelling is front and center in the chapter on action in Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, as well as in other essays she writes. And the point is that action becomes meaningful not by the actor, but by the people observing it and then telling the stories about it and inserting it into the common world. And her claim is that your action of resistance will be made meaningful. It will become a story. So I don't know if that. I mean, I think I think you're right. If the claim is that Arendt is saying this can stop the killing, I don't know if that's correct. Obviously it wasn't correct in this period. Although, and again, this is something I've struggled with, but I have thought is that the fact that we have stories of resistance during the Holocaust and other events, I believe, will make it much harder for a future totalitarian leader to solidify power. Now, I could be wrong. I think there will be more people inspired by the stories of resistance that they know and tell the next time than there were the last time. I could be wrong. I see Peter shaking his head, so I gather he disagrees. We talked a bit. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if this is true because this is Twitter, but there was a quotation from supposedly from the Honorable Orange person in the White House who said that he read Mein Kampf I don't know if I can believe that he read Mein Kampf, but that he learned a lot from it. So, I mean, I don't know if it was a serious quote by some serious person, in the sense that would sort of suggest that history that we want to see reinterpreted and effective is repeated, as well as the history of things and ideas that we dread being regurgitated, revised, and repeated. So this is something that she doesn't address, obviously. She also gives a lot of hypothetical examples of things. Imagine if, and they're actually happening today, on various, even in the epilogue where she says, imagine if somebody comes and kidnaps a leader from Kentucky or whatever. I mean, that's totally imaginable today, when we think about Khashoggi and things like that, you know. So it's kind of difficult to expect Hannah Arendt to have solved the problems of today, because she did write it at a time, and at that time, the Holocaust, by survivors of the Holocaust, at least those in Israel, was never spoken about. There are many people who survived the Holocaust who refused to talk about it, who refused to write about it. And those who did write about it were called Staligists, and they were somewhat considered diminished writers. They were not respected as true writers of great literature or of enormous meaning, because they were, maybe the image would be, they were somewhat kvetching. But I'm old enough to remember this period of a lot of literature that was written at the time. It wasn't serious. Later we see things like Shoah, and we see other works of art that are treated with somewhat greater respect. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but I don't hold her responsible for not giving us hope.
Right. I don't think hope and right. Oh, wait.
No, go ahead, Peter. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that I don't think hope. Actually, I think hope is the antidote to pessimism. That you can be pessimistic, but Cornel West says, "I'm still not that I'm a fan, a prisoner of hope." And I think she does give us hope, and I live hope off of the idea that the arc of the universe bends towards justice. I think our hope has to be founded on the places where the better educative moments are, and I don't think the Holocaust is one, other than for those who want to reenact it. Once you start looking at what happens in 39 and on, it's a textbook for those who want to commit genocide. And sadly, post-Arendt, you have a series of genocides, post Eichmann. You have in Jerusalem, you have a series of genocides that confound or Alison at least would give pessimists a good time to suggest that we haven't learned any lessons from it, because you do have at least survivors' testimony, at the very least, for Guatemala and for Rwanda and Darfur to some extent, if you want to call that a genocide. Maybe not for Cambodia at that point, but it's a bad track record up till then. I think the hope is that we're going to act much sooner. I still think that's the only prayer. Once this thing is in progress, I've probably said too many times, I think it's a very hard thing for any individual to stop, no matter how many beautiful acts a good number of individuals make. The percentage is always going to be too small in such a situation to be able to put a dent into it.
I don't think the Holocaust is the place to look for hope. The great historian Salo Baron used to talk about the lachrymose interpretation of Jewish history, where you kind of telescope and only bring into focus the saddest, worst chapters. But if you take a look at the whole of Jewish history, there are many hopeful chapters. And at least until this day, one of the most hopeful is that of the United States.
I just wanted to say that, first of all, this notion of hope arising out of the storytelling, that is a change in the way people will respond because the stories are there, it takes me back to Hannah Arendt's idea of the Greek hero, the Greeks in general, who who she imagines find immortality by doing acts that will be remembered. It's the remembrance of the acts that creates the immortality for the Greeks and therefore for people. I think that's a conclusion that she draws, a remembrance of the acts. And so, although I agree with a lot that has been said here, I do need to point out that storytelling is often controlled. And we've seen in totalitarian regimes the complete distortion and in some cases erasure of actual events, let alone people's stories. And although stories always circulated underground in totalitarian regimes, and there always seemed to be resistance, and I just want to say that resistance comes along a very long spectrum. So if there are people who are out there, prepared, fighting and prepared to die, and then there are people who, will slip somebody a visa or something like that, and walk away. So there's different levels of resistance. But I think where I'm going with all of this is that I share Peter's notion that the antidote to pessimism is hope. The only antidote to pessimism is hope. That there is some kind of combination that a person can hold in his mind of both pessimism and hope. That you can look at the world with open eyes and say, "My God is going down the tubes," and at the same time say, "Hey, we are people. We can do something about this, and the people will." And that kind of feeling, I think, is something that I share. And I don't know whether other people feel that, but for me, the Holocaust has a particular meaning, which I don't want to spend time here talking about, but it represents to me the very depth, the deepest form of evil that people are capable of, but only the deepest, that people are capable of all kinds of evil. And it's not only that Holocaust, but as Peter has mentioned, other genocides since.
I always forget who admin is, but someone who wrote from admin in the chat recommends A.L. Press's book, Beautiful Souls. So A.L. is a friend of mine, and his book is a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. And as admin says, it tells 4 cases of people who stood up for what they believed in was right in difficult circumstances. These were people who, and what A.L. to some degree asks in that book is why? What makes somebody stand up, risk their lives, risk their, well, sometimes their reputation, but in these cases, almost always their lives, and do what they consider to be the right thing. And I don't think there's a single conclusion in the book, but I think one of the core arguments he makes is that each one of these beautiful souls, as he calls them, simply acted because they didn't think they could act any other way. They had a belief system, whether it was religious, or it came from their mother, or it came from their idea of themselves, that if they had acted otherwise, they simply could not have lived with themselves. So this, to some degree, maybe, it raises the question of what makes us act courageously at a time, and how we might, and he doesn't so much talk about what we've been talking about, the inspiration of stories or heroes. It's more that they have a belief system, and yet, as Jack, I think, rightly brings up, this idea of immortality in Arendt, which is very important for her. The idea that for her, when you do something great, when you do an act that will be remembered, um, uh, even if it's practically useless, it guarantees you, or it hopes to guarantee you, a kind of immortality, um, and a certain greatness, and that to her is is absolutely essential to human life. Again, I guess I don't think she's making the argument that this will mean that genocides won't happen, or that we'll be able to prevent them. I do think she's making the argument that the fact that acts like this are remembered and stories are told and people are inspired by them, um, will allow the world to remain fit for human habitation in spite of what other things happen. I take that to be her argument. Um, and It's not an argument about actually preventing genocide. It's an argument about keeping the world a humanly habitable world, because we have stories of people who won't comply. That to me is her argument.
So sorry to push back again.
Roger, can I just quickly, Peter, can I just add something quickly to what Roger just said? I think it's also, and this may be the same thing you just said, Roger, but we are focusing on the person taking the, heroic action in a threatening time. But I think we also should focus on the people who then hear the story of the heroic action. The fact, there has to be an audience, the story doesn't get repeated. So it seems to me that she's also saying something about the people who themselves might not be willing or able to do, or may not be sure that they would, as someone might have done in a heroic way. But the fact that we would want to tell the story, the fact that there would be a hush in the courtroom when a story like that is told, to me speaks volumes as well. And I think it's important to focus on that side of it as well.
I think that's right, and maybe the hope comes not from the actor, but from the people telling the story. But Peter, I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, sorry to damp things, because I totally agree with that, and I love the commentary about the hush in the courtroom. That's almost, in some ways, more telling than the story, because it shows a common sensibility about wanting that to be the story, right? I think it's fantastic. The trouble for me is that you can get false hope sometimes from heroic stories of individuals, and they're much more interesting. They bring me to tears oftentimes. I'd like us to tell stories about, let's say, mammograms, colonoscopies, seatbelts. They're not very dramatic. They're not very exciting because it's not one person doing it. But in each case, nobody wanted to do any of those three things. I remember so much resistance to seatbelts. I've been told mammograms are not pleasant to go through. I know I don't want to do another colonoscopy, but we do them. And I'm not pretending that's heroic. I'm claiming that that's a more hopeful statement about the human condition. And I think the tragedy is that we don't yet get how much the Holocaust could be anywhere, that democracy can turn off in a second. I think democracy is our seatbelt, and I think we don't value it enough to keep it attached.
There's a book by Tsvetan Todorov, the French theorist who died a few years ago, called Facing the Extreme, I think. Someone can check the title for me if I have it wrong. And he makes somewhat similar of an argument that Peter just made, which is that we typically think of the hero as this individual who's risked great things and been a resistance fighter or saved people, but he looks for acts of heroism in the quotidian daily existence. He talks about, there's one story he tells about a woman who, she and her mother were on a line for in a concentration camp, and the mother got put in the line of people to be gassed, and she went and walked with her mother. And he's like, she didn't lead any resistance. She didn't, fight anybody, but that was heroic. in his telling. And I don't know if that's exactly what you're after, Peter, but the whole book, Facing the Extreme, is about acts like that, and that we should be as concerned with people doing that as people who, resist and fight.
Say something here.
Roger, let
Yeah.
me add on to that.
Well, let's first.
Okay.
We have
Susan.
Susan. Yes.
Yeah. There's a book I've been trying to remember that I read, I think last year, and I need to look for it in my library, about a German couple, working class. It's a long book, but they're like, quote, nobody. They both go to work, their jobs are drudgery, but they're really, want to resist, but they don't know what to do. Did anybody know this book? And they end up printing out little pamphlets or just sheets of paper, and they leave them anonymously around the city. Nobody knows, if they found, I think at the end, I can't remember if they get found out and executed. Does this sound familiar? This book?
It sounds like the White Rose story, but I'm not sure. But those were younger people. You said these are older people.
No, this was an older couple, just the
Yeah.
two of them. I think they had lost a son at some point. They were like people who lived in a small place by themselves. Nobody knew them. No one's heard of this. Okay, I'm going to try to find it and I'll post it.
Okay.
To go back to the discussion of Milgram, because I recently heard a podcast about research now looking at the researcher's role in that Milgram study and the inability of people to realize how much influence they actually have. And so they use students to go out and do what seem to be small tasks, and these students are feeling overwhelmed at asking anybody to do what they want. So I guess I have been obsessing over the whole concept of will, and it seems to me that one of the positive places to look at is this idea of political will in the Danish, and what does that mean, and how do we access our own will? And I think that maybe contributes to the acts of resistance. I'm hoping, I guess, that it does.
Sorry to jump in again. I'm sorry I'm talking so much. Actually, Milgram, there's many experiments that Milgram runs in that same study, one of which was if there's a disagreement amongst the scientists who are asking to apply the shocks, that the number of people who apply the shocks to the bad spots on the board goes down. If there's a second subject who's not really a subject, it's a plant, who doesn't want to do it, then the subject who's being watched will also not comply as much. And so there are lots of variations that Milgram attends to the point of how counterexamples can give us the fortitude to act differently. So the Milgram study isn't just about the famous version, it's about many other versions that tell a tale to the extent that some of what we've been talking about, maybe to what Arendt's talking about, except it's not in the case of a totalitarian state. You just have a scientist there telling you to do this for the sake of the experiment. So that's where I think it's a little more helpful in the case where you don't have a police state than in the case where you do have a police state. Just to piggyback on the other story, which I don't know, but I have heard of these little things that were set up around Germany. There's a couple of people at Kodak who noticed that there was a lot of film being sent for some reason to South Africa. And they said, wait a second, what is this for? And they realized it was for the passes that were allowing the apartheid system to be in place. And they began, and noticing that these were quote unquote nobodies, and they began what became a revolution against apartheid by asking for people to stop buying Kodak, to stop Kodak from being complicit. And Kodak pulls out of being a sponsor in a way of the apartheid regime that would allow people to be separated based on these passes.
Yeah, and this ties into the point Arendt makes throughout earlier chapters that we've talked a lot about how Eichmann never encountered somebody who said, stop what you're doing, it's wrong, right? Arendt is just amazed that nobody ever said to him, how can you do this? And that lack of, as Peter just said, a counter, Yeah, I mean, Milgram did dozens and dozens of these experiments, and there were many different situations that made compliance go down to very low numbers. I mean, under 10%. Um, Even in the main study that we're all talking about, the compliance is not close to 100%. I think it's like 60%, or 70, maybe up to 70 in some instances. But I mean, I think it is important to remember that while most people will comply, as RN says, some will not. And one of the things that increases the likelihood of more people not complying are other people not complying, and the stories about it and the telling about it, which may not stop it in a totalitarian state. We should be clear about that, but will make people think and make them uncomfortable, and that is that's part of what I think she calls a human world. I mean, maybe I'm being a little too literal and a little too but I think her claim is not that this will be practical in the sense that it will stop things, but it will not be practically useless in that it does impact our world and make our world more human.
Roger, I had a point to that I think might be interesting.
Great.
I actually.
What happened to Jason?
I don't know what happened to him. Jason, are you there? He may have gotten.
So while we're waiting for Jason, there's something I'd like to add here about Milgram, which is that Milgram is doing his experiments in the United States, where there is already a tradition of individual liberty, and a sense that people are act on their own, so to speak. That was not the culture in Germany. Germany had a culture of compliance and obedience at the time that Hitler came to power. And it's interesting to me that the resistance to Stalinism in the Soviet Union was significantly greater than it was to Hitler, largely because Stalin came to power under the guise of a revolution for individual freedom. That actually encouraged resistance to a certain degree. Of course, he killed them all off anyway. But the point is that the resistance was there because in some ways it was in the culture, and it was not in the culture in Germany. That's really the point that I want to make.
Well, the problem is that's a point that makes the Milgram study even more damning. Because if you're seeing that 2 out of 3 people who are coming from a society which values liberty and freedom of thought are ready to go to the nth degree on a board that potentially electrocutes somebody to death, then you've made the number is greater, 66% in that case, because it shows that your cultural training hasn't saved you from doing something that the authorities simply told you to do.
Yes, I think that's right, Peter. But of course, the balance on that is that there are cultural forces in America that push toward obedience, and especially the church and so on and so forth. All of that is always present. So it's a complex matter. I'm not saying that it's one way or the other. I'm just pointing out that there is a difference that creates a difference.
Agreed, and also those were people coming out of the 50s, which was a more compliant time. It would be interesting if the same study was done in the early 70s after the 60s had rejuvenated a sense of protest against authority.
I think those are fair points. Let me just turn quickly to the next chapter and highlight 1 or 2 things, and then we can talk about whichever chapters you want. I just want to make sure we at least address the last chapter on judgment, appeal, and execution. The main there's 2 main points in this chapter as far as I get it, and they start on page 244. The first one is she goes through very factually the different charges that Eichmann was charged with, accused of, and convicted of. The one charge he was not convicted of was conspiracy, which would have made him one of the leaders and automatic responsible, as she says, for everything having to do with the final solution. He was not found to have been one of the conspirators. There were 15 counts that he was found guilty of. Counts 1 through 4 were crimes, different aspects of crimes against the Jewish people, namely the intent to destroy the Jewish people by causing the killing of millions of Jews, by placing of millions of Jews under conditions which were likely to lead to their physical destruction, by causing serious bodily mental harm to them, and by directing that births be banned and pregnancies interrupted amongst Jewish women in Theresienstadt. There were then counts 5 through 12, which were crimes against humanity amongst people who were not Jews. And then there were the last 3 charges, 13 through 15, were his for being a member of certain illegal institutions or illegal by international law institutions. He was found guilty of all 15 of these counts by the trial court. And on 246, she makes I think an important has an important discussion where she says that Eichmann himself said that he did all these things, but not did them. He only aided and abetted them. This is a legal term for being an accomplice as opposed to the actual person doing them. And what she says is that the trial court admitted that he was right, insofar as they said that they said, quote, expressing his activities in terms of Section 23 of the Israeli Criminal Code Ordinance, we should say that they were mainly those of a person soliciting by giving counsel or advice to others, and of one who enabled or aided others in the criminal act. So they basically admit that under Israeli law, what Eichmann was really guilty of is not the crimes against the Jewish people and crimes against humanity, but of aiding and abetting those crimes. But then, she says, the judges made the important, and she thinks right, observation that, quote, in such an enormous and complicated crime as the one we are now considering, wherein many people participated on various levels and in various modes of activity, the planners, the organizers, and those executing the deeds according to their various ranks, there is not much point in using the ordinary concepts of counseling and soliciting to commit a crime. And then they say, on the contrary, in general, in crimes, in bureaucratic crimes like the Holocaust, the degree of responsibility increases as we draw further away from the man who uses the fatal instrument with his own hands. And so this becomes Arendt's, she agrees with the court that even though under normal criminal law situations, what Eichmann did was but was aiding and abetting. She says, in these kind of cases, first of all, it would be absurd to accuse him of aiding and abetting. What he did was much worse. And the reason you can say that is that the degree of responsibility increases as we draw further away from the man who uses the fatal instrument. The appellate court, actually, she says, didn't understand that and revised the actual judgment of the trial court and said that Eichmann had received no superior orders and that he was his own superior, and he gave all orders in matters that concern Jewish affairs. So she says that the appellate court really got it wrong and wanted to insist that Eichmann did all these things. But she thinks that the trial court gets it right much more in a much more profound way. So I thought I'd at least highlight that for you all and see if that's something we want to discuss, or we can continue on with the earlier discussion as well about the evidence and the witnesses. And I think Justin's back on. So Justin, if you want to jump in, you can. I mean, Jason is back on. So Jason, if you want to jump in, we seem to have lost you for a while.
I apologize. My internet connection is really weak here due to some storms. All I was wanting to bring forward about the question of the necessity of storytelling, I came across Arden on the question of storytelling and action. And further research came across the idea that really we are predisposed to the heroes in stories. And that's why they're so important, because we're kind of hardwired per the narratology of the day. We appear to be hardwired to have a simpatico with the hero's point of view, even despite our own priors. It's just part of the process of partaking of a story, is that you will actually hear a hero out if they aren't there.
So Jason, I think I heard most of what you said, but we lost you now. I'm sorry. But why don't we let other people comment or move on? So Terry says that he's skeptical that no one ever told Eichmann that what he was doing was wrong. I mean, that's a fine point. Except I don't know. All we know is that Eichmann says it. All the witnesses, even some of the witnesses who were there, said to when asked by the judges, "Did you ever say that?" They said no. And they were, I think, largely trying to flatter him, because we have to remember that most of the people who were working with him, the Jewish people especially, were trying to get something out of him. So they didn't want to challenge him. They wanted to somehow flatter him. And most of the Germans that he encountered didn't say such things. It's possible, of course, that someone did, but we don't know of any, and he says that none did.
No, and I'm not really trying to challenge it either, Roger. It just, I mean, literally what I said. I'm skeptical about that, and we all, we create our own echo chambers, and I'm sure that was happening in a major way. But I think you could in front of him and scream that it was wrong, and it wouldn't have. Absolutely take the point. It's not worth trying to figure out because we'll never know.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Scott asked us about the trolley problem. The trolley problem is, two train is running along the tracks, and there's one person on the track here, and there's a bus with a bunch of kids on it over there, and you're the conductor. Do you flip the switch so that you only hit one person and kill them rather than potentially killing the 30 kids on the bus? It's one of those moral dilemmas that philosophers like to tell. I don't know. I'm not sure why you bring it up here, Scott. Maybe you want to say more about it?
Yeah, so, with the trolley problem, I'm just trying to think of how somebody like Eichmann or Nazis themselves can kind of absolve themselves from responsibility. And with the trolley problem, to go more specific, you have two scenarios. You have one scenario where there's a child who's on a who's on a track, and you see a train coming, and I'm sorry. There's a child who's on a track, and then and then you see a train coming, and you can save. And then on the other track, there's 5 people. You can save the 5 kids that are going to get hit by the train by pulling the lever that would cause the train to go to the other track that would only hit one person. And if you ask, and I've been in a class where this was asked for the first time, if you ask people, would you pull the lever so that the train would go to the track that would just kill one person versus the 5 people, like 87%, like 85, 90% said that they would do that. So, and then you have the other situation where you have the 5 kids who are on the track, and you see a train coming, and you're on a bridge, and there's a big fat man right at the edge of the bridge looking over the bridge, and you know if you push him over the bridge and he blocks the train, he will die, but the 5 kids will be saved. And when you ask the same group of people if they would do that, it's only like 5% or 10% of the people that would do that. But if you look at it from a strictly utilitarian basis, the same thing is occurring. The only difference is in the first scenario, you're not physically touching the person. You're not physically pushing the person. You're just pulling a lever. And so, like, I was wondering if there was an analogy, whereas, the Eichmann, the Nazis, they think, they're kind of in the pulling the lever thing, where I'm just pulling the lever. I'm not actually pushing the person. And so once again, if you look at it from a utilitarian standpoint, there really should be no difference. You're killing one person to save 5. It's just in the one situation you're removed from actually physically pushing the person. You're pulling a lever. Now I know that the calculus is flipped. It's inverted, but I was wondering if it's kind of the same type of mentality.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that that's a feeling people have. I mean, it's one of the reasons Eichmann will say, in the chapter that we're reading, the last chapter that we just read, I am not a monster. I am made out to be on page 248. He wants to say that not justice was not done to him, that he was not a Jew hater, that he was not a murderer, that he simply obeyed. Now, it's not the same thing as flipping a switch versus pushing, but it's for him, it was an important distinction. I think for Arendt, it was not.
If Roger, if we
Yeah.
disregard the moral, the Kantian perspective here, that there is only one real moral solution, we see it today when we get migrants being put into cages, that perhaps the belief of those who do that is that there is a higher truth, that there is something more important. And I think to a large extent, perhaps the Nazis or those who participated in that did believe that there was a higher moral imperative than the atrocity that they were committing. And I think that we see that all the time. So, I mean, to this day, it hasn't changed.
But the Nazis would claim that they were committing a heroic act by killing Jews because they felt Jews perhaps not different. I'm not in any way claiming this. I'm just suggesting what the ideologues within the Nazis might have thought, that Jews are a gangrenous leg of the German body, and they had to be annihilated because they would continue to pollute and destroy the body itself. And so I don't think it's about an innocent person on one track, and I think it's a Philippa Foot dilemma that was posed, and it's mostly just to show how immature or unpracticed we are in moral dilemma solving, because I don't think she suggests that it would be the 1 versus the 5. I don't know if she comes down on one way or the other on it, and one could say that each is equal because they're each each a human being is an infinite set of possibilities, so 1 and 5 doesn't matter. 1 infinite is the same as 5 infinite. But leaving that aside, the Nazis don't believe that they're doing something horrific. They think they're saving the German body and the world's body by eliminating a disease.
Yeah, and Eichmann certainly would not have said that they were eliminating a disease. That's not the way he spoke. If you read Eichmann's accounts of this, especially when he was in Argentina, when he was talking to Wilhelm Sassen, he described the Jews as clever and smart and the great threat to German power. So that for him it was about, the way he justified it to himself was that the Jews were the great threat to a German Reich and a German Aryan rule, and they had to be eliminated because they were the other great ethnic power. He actually, that's the way he portrayed it in his writings and interviews with Sassen, which is not to, just to say that many of the higher level Nazis did not share the vehement anti-Semitism that they then used as propaganda for the masses. They actually saw it as a battle, and the Jews as their enemy. But they still used that propaganda, even if they themselves thought didn't think much of it personally.
And some were just toadies to Hitler, period. Some were just, he's in charge. You want to have a good house and a nice job. You just follow the leader.
I think that's right.
And there were several intellectuals who steered them in that direction. Schmidt and Herder and various others who the Germans were reading, and therefore really believed that they were cleaning, they were purifying, they were doing the right thing. I don't think that's changed either if you see what Trump thinks he's doing with Latin American migrants.
That's fair. Yeah, Howard?
As I've read this book, I've been troubled and because my mind keeps going on to our contemporary world and the many actions of what they call the global north and their effects throughout the rest of the world. But I want to, so that's just my mindset. But when you talk about the judgment of both the trial court and the appeal court, I think one of the things that this book also showed me, I wouldn't say showed me, affirmed what I already believed, is that the judicial process is totally out of touch, in a sense, with the actual dilemmas we have as human beings in trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. It's necessarily reductive. So Arendt shows throughout this book that this whole trial, first of all, is questionable from the point of view of international law from the moment of the kidnapping, and then it's already been decided before the first word of testimony is heard. And as you pointed out earlier, the inadequacy that's provided to the defendant with respect to the manpower and intellectual power that he needs to adequately defend himself compared to what's provided for the prosecution. So the questions that we debated for most of this discussion about the need to act for the few, the need to resist and to be vocal, none of those are addressed by the legal system. And so this dichotomy, I think, is something that is also part of this story and part of this that she's telling. And it's interesting to me how her mind shifts when she gets to talking about the judgment. I don't know what the significance of that is, but I think that we should maybe spend, we don't have much time left, but a little bit on this question of the two judgments and the legal system, and how the legal system and the ethical, moral, citizen system, or whatever you want to call it, work together.
Thanks, Howard. That's an excellent point. And so let me first just say that we will talk about that a lot in our next session. In the epilogue, that becomes one of the main themes of the entire epilogue, which is the inadequacy of the legal system to deal with an extraordinary, unprecedented case like Eichmann's and the Holocaust. So that will be, and she's going to say that the very unprecedented nature of this and the fact that the judges felt the need to render justice under a kind of legal system is what caused many of the problems in the trial. And that she's going to, at the end of her epilogue, actually suggest that what they needed to do was break free of the legal system and judge politically outside of it, which all of their legal training prevented them from being able to do. And so that's going to be a major part of her argument in the epilogue. So, I think what you're saying is absolutely right, and we will talk about it next session. On the question of the two different judgments, that goes to it in a certain way. What the trial court did is say, look, we're stuck with this law, but we realize that to convict him of aiding and abetting would be sort of offensive to our sense of justice. And so what we're going to understand is we need to rethink it and understand that in a crime like this, our normal legal criteria need to be expanded. In such an enormous and complicated crime, there is not much point in using the ordinary concept of counseling and soliciting. That's a quote from the court. And then they come up with this, she thinks, quite elegant solution, which is that the degree of responsibility increases as we draw further away from the man who uses the fatal instrument. The appeals court for her simply just doesn't address this problem and wants to say that he was the main actor in the whole final solution, and she thinks they really get it wrong. But she sees the trial court struggling with exactly the issue you raised, Howard.
Yeah, so what the appeals court does here, which is highly unusual for an appeals court, is they substitute themselves for the finders of fact, which is usually in the legal system the job of the trial court.
That's right. Yeah,
And,
as she said,
well,
it was a strange revision of the judgment, which was, and I think in part because the trial court was so honest in her reading that they, in a sense, said Eichmann was not the head of the final solution as the prosecution wanted to present him, and yet we have to still find him guilty, and they did, and they found a way to do it. And I think the appeals court felt the need to reassert the prosecution's case for whatever reason. I just want to point out one last part of the chapter, which may be the most famous part, but we haven't talked about it yet, although we've been talking about it all this whole time we're reading the book, on page 252, where in the last two paragraphs of the main text before the epilogue, she says, Adolf Eichmann went to the gallows with great dignity. He had asked for a bottle of red wine, had drunk half of it. He refused the help of a Protestant minister. He rejected wearing a hood. He asked to loosen the bonds so he could stand straight. He said, "We shall meet again after a short long," and I shall not. Sorry, I live in New York, so I apologize for the horns. I shall not forget them. And in the face of death, he had found the cliche used in funeral oratory. Under the gallows, his memory played him the last trick. He was elated, and he forgot that this was his own funeral. It was as though in those last minutes he was summing up the lesson that this long course in human wickedness had taught us. The lesson of the fearsome, word and thought defying banality of evil. And I always want to remind myself and others that she actually never uses the term the banality of evil in the book, except here. But it's not just the banality of evil. It's the fearsome, word and thought defying banality of evil. And I think we would all do well whenever we say the banality of evil to think to ourselves and maybe even say the fearsome, word and thought defying banality of evil. What does that mean? It's the banality in which you are so thoughtless that you speak in cliches, you don't speak real things, you don't see the world truthfully. And that's what's fearsome, is the word and thought defying banality of evil. And it just strikes me that we can't discuss this chapter in the book and not at least remember that this is the only time she uses the word the banality of evil in the book until the postscript.
Well, in the title.
Say that again? Louder?
The title.
Well, the title, but that's not her title, yeah. A
Not
report
approve
on
it? Did she not approve it?
Sam probably knows more about that than I do. Sam, do you know if she approved the title or if she liked the title?
Hey, can you hear me good?
Yeah.
So yes, the first time she uses the word banality, so the first instance of the word banality in relationship to the Holocaust occurs in her correspondence with Jaspers. And then the second time that she uses it to describe the proceedings is in her correspondence with Heinrich Flücker right after she arrives in Israel. And so I think that the term in relationship to evil was always present in her consciousness. And as far as I know, in the original manuscript in the New York Public Library, this is her title. I can go back through, but this is the title that was on it from the beginning, as far as I can tell. But it's the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and that's how it was billed. And I think a report on the banality of evil is is the tagline there. But I think it's important, what Roger said, to draw us, to emphasize that Arendt never she never states it that clearly. She never says this is the banality of evil, and I think that's important because it's not one thing, right? It's not a fixed, rigid conceptual framework that we can hold up and apply to things. The banality of evil for her is the way she thinks about philosophical concepts, has many different elements to it, and it's flexible, and it can apply to different kinds of situations of evil that occur in the world. It's not a one-to-one. And I think sometimes when people say this is Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, they want to say it is something, and that's in part what led to a lot of confusion when she initially published it.
Susan, I think you're trying to talk, but I'm not hearing you.
No, I'm sorry, no.
Okay. Any final comments? I also want to I want to suggest that we maybe read the epilogue separately from the postscript because that's going to be very rich, and I want to suggest that we read it either next week or the week after next. But I'll ask people if they have a preference because otherwise we're off for almost 4 weeks until April 17th, and I think it's actually worth splitting up the epilogue and the postscript. So if we meet in a week or in 2 weeks, is that okay? Does anyone have any issues with that? Next week, I see someone. Nancy says. So yeah, we'll put it on the agenda. We'll change the website and we'll send out a reminder. But we'll meet next Friday. The reason we were going to take a long break is that we were supposed to be on spring break, but at this point, we're all teaching virtually anyway. And so I can certainly be around, and I think it would be good to read the epilogue next week, and then we'll do the postscript on the 17th as we had originally planned. Is that all good? Any final comments before we head out?
Was there going to be a May 1st meeting? That was on the original schedule, or are there just 2 more?
I think there's just 2 more. We have the epilogue, and then we have the postscript. And so, yeah, that's what we have.
So April 17th will be the last meeting.
Exactly, and we'll do next week, which is what? April, which is March 20th will be our next meeting. Okay.
And will you be circulating the chapter from Daphna's book? I saw some discussion about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the only way we can circulate it, and I don't know if Daphna's willing to do this, if she sends it as if you're willing to send it as a PDF to us, we can then send it to those of you who want it. We can take Craig or Sam, can we get a list of the people who maybe email us if you would, or we'll send it. We can send it to all the people who were on the call today. Daphna's written a new book in which she has a chapter on Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she's offered to share it. Is that okay to send a PDF around, Daphna? I don't want to presume.
I would be honored.
Okay. So, great. We'll do that. And maybe we can even, on either before April 17th or on May 1st, add in a discussion, and we can talk about Daphna's chapter if we want, if people want to do that. Sound good? All right.
Very good.
Thank you all. Really enjoyed reading this with you today. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Please stay healthy and safe in this somewhat crazy time. We'll see you all in next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.